The lights of the grand ballroom, which once twinkled over the matriarch's face, Doña Isadora, abruptly extinguished, plunging her into a revealing gloom, just as the notary announced that the family fortune, promised by contract to a stranger, was now indisputably hers, and that the man who had sworn eternal love to her that very night stood by her side with a conviction that shattered years of deceit. That dawn, destiny wove with invisible threads the sweetest vindication, laying bare the cruel injustice that had condemned a young woman to contempt. Hello, my dear friend. Prepare yourself, because this is not a fairy tale where love conquers all effortlessly. It is a saga of sacrifices, of silent humiliations, and of a love that blossoms in the most arid field of obligation. Imagine for a moment Valeria, a young woman whose existence unfolded in the shadow of a monumental family debt and the imminent threat of losing everything. Her figure, slender but tense with anxiety, moved with the precision of a puppet on invisible strings. She always wore sober clothes, often dark and unadorned, and improvised armor against the looks of pity or, worse, judgment that followed her since her father's family business, a publishing house for antique books, had gone bankrupt. Her hands, oh, those hands were a living testament to precarity. Knuckles reddened by the constant cold of her modest apartment. Nails, though always clean, short and without the polish that had once adorned her fingers before the weight of the world fell upon her shoulders. They were hands that worked, that bore the weight of a faded hope, that spoke of a fragility that few dared to see. Her ash-brown hair, which barely caught the light, was usually pulled back in a low, practical bun, without the freedom of the waves that once framed her face. Her eyes, however, were her most striking feature. A deep hazel, they observed the world with a mix of melancholy and a spark of intelligence that ignited fleetingly when she thought she wasn't being watched. But no one saw her, did they? Not really. To most, Valeria was just the bankrupt bookseller's daughter, the silent girl who carried her family's shame. The glitter of luxury shop windows, the carefree laughter of people in the streets, all of it was alien to her, a parallel reality to her own existence, marked by the shadow of a debt that grew every day. You remember that afternoon, don't you, my dear friend, when Aunt Elvira, a distant cousin of her father's, a woman of impeccable appearance and forced smile, said to her in a honeyed voice, yet laden with contempt, "Valeria, dear, what a pity about your father. He was always a dreamer, wasn't he? It's a shame his passion couldn't pay the bills. I hope you find a good solution to save your family, though, with that record, it will be difficult." Valeria felt a pang, something like an icy stab in her stomach. It wasn't the criticism, which she was already used to, but the condescension, the demonstration of superiority in its cruelest form. Her hands trembled barely perceptibly, but the knot in her throat was a silent scream only she could hear. She thought of her father, slumped in his favorite chair, his gaze lost in space, overwhelmed by guilt, and of her little sister, Sophia, whose dreams of studying ballet were cut short by the pressing need to pay rent and medicine for her father, whose health deteriorated daily from stress. Every humiliation, every look of disdain, was a constant reminder of her insignificance in that world of wealth and power, where she was barely a shadow, an echo. The solution came, like a ray of hope and despair at once, in the form of a marriage contract. An arranged marriage with the heir of one of the country's most powerful and wealthiest families, the Santoros, known for their financial empire and impeccable reputation. Valeria's father, in a desperate attempt to save his publishing house from total bankruptcy and protect his family from ruin, had accepted an agreement that linked him to the Santoros through the union of his daughter with their eldest son, Gabriel Santoro. In return, the Santoros would settle the debt and give Valeria's family a sum of money to start anew. It was a loveless deal without romance, a commercial transaction masked as a marital union. For Valeria, it was a sale, a condemnation. And so it was, my friend, that Valeria, the humiliated young woman, found herself on her wedding day at the altar of a majestic church. With the afternoon sun filtering through the stained glass windows and painting the face of a man she barely knew with colors. Gabriel Santoro was a stranger to her. She had seen him a couple of times in formal meetings where conversations were cold and the air dense with calculations. He was tall, with an athletic build, intense blue eyes, and a chiseled face. But in his eyes there was no emotion, only a glacial distance. He wore an impeccable groom's suit, but his posture was rigid, as if he were serving a sentence. Beside him, Doña Isadora, the Santoro matriarch, a woman of wrought iron and a glacial gaze, watched Valeria with barely veiled contempt. Her lips, stained a deep red, barely moved to offer a welcome that sounded more like an ultimatum. Valeria, we hope you understand the honor of this union and the responsibility. My son is a busy man. Your role is to be a discreet and loyal wife, and to produce an heir. Nothing more. Her words were an icy knife that plunged into Valeria's chest. Humiliation flushed her face like a searing fire, an uncomfortable heat that dried her mouth and made her palms sweat. She felt the eyes of all the guests on her, the curious glances, the false smiles, the whispers. She was the bought bride, the transaction visible to the whole world. She wanted to scream, to defend her dignity, but the words stuck in her throat, turning into a knot of silent frustration. She merely nodded, lowered her gaze, moved forward, because any confrontation meant the risk of breaking the agreement and condemning her family to irreversible ruin. Her heart shrank with every criticism, not from wounded pride, but from the visceral fear of failing, of not being able to protect her own. It was a constant fear, a faithful companion every day. But Valeria, my friend, was not just a contract bride. Beneath that facade of humility and resignation lay a brilliant mind, a sharp intellect, and a prodigious memory. She had devoured books since childhood, escaping raw reality through the dusty pages of her father's library. Although the business had gone bankrupt, her mind remained intact, a living library. Every night, before the wedding, she immersed herself in volumes on economics, business law, the history of great fortunes, absorbing knowledge like a thirsty sponge. It was a hidden treasure, an intellectual jewel that no one had discovered, not even her own family, too preoccupied with survival. Often, while the servants in the Santoro mansion saw her as the poor new lady, Valeria discreetly listened to the conversations of the family's executives and lawyers, analyzing their arguments, identifying their fallacies, understanding the complex power dynamics that governed that world, which was so alien to her and to which she now, by force, belonged. She was a silent observer, a student without a school, a scholar disguised as a trophy wife. And so it was. One ordinary afternoon, months after the wedding. As Valeria strolled through the immense library of the Santoro mansion, a place where the dust of old volumes and the scent of cedar mingled with the echo of opulent silence. Gabriel was often absent, immersed in family business or his own activities, and Valeria, to avoid Doña Isadora and her constant reproaches, took refuge among the books. Her fingers, caressing spine after spine, stumbled upon a particular volume, an old botanical treatise, leather-bound, which seemed out of place in that collection of finance and politics. Curiosity, a spark she rarely allowed herself to ignite in her life, prompted her to open it. Inside, among its pages, there were no dried flowers, but a single yellowed sheet of paper, written in elegant and familiar calligraphy. It was a letter, but not just any letter. It was addressed to her grandmother, Ilara, from a certain Marco. It spoke of an unjust agreement and a truth that must be revealed, mentioning an old trust that had been frozen for decades and affected the legitimate heirs. Her pulse quickened. At first, she thought it was nonsense, perhaps an old, insignificant family intrigue. But something, a deep intuition, an ancestral whisper in her soul, told her it was not so. Mrs. Clara, one of the Santoro mansion cooks, an elderly woman with kind eyes, and the only person who had ever shown her a shred of genuine kindness in that house, used to say that some things are felt in the bones. This, definitely, was felt in the bones. The calligraphy, astonishingly similar to her grandmother's, sent a shiver down her spine. An unjust agreement. Trust. Legitimate heirs. She murmured to herself, as her rough fingers caressed the aged texture of the paper. Her mind, accustomed to unraveling logical problems and memorizing complex sequences of tasks, began to process the information instinctively. It was a tiny seed, a grain of sand in a desert. But for Valeria, it represented the only anomaly in her predictable and monotonous existence. Her heart skipped a beat, in a way she had never experienced before. It wasn't fear, not even pure astonishment, but a kind of contained excitement. The feeling of being on the verge of something monumental, of a truth that until then had eluded her, perhaps deliberately hidden. Incredulity fought for a moment with intuition. It can't be. It's just an old letter, she told herself, trying to quell the hope that was already blossoming. But the image of the handwriting, strangely familiar, wouldn't leave. The way certain letters curved, the strokes, the small imperfections, reminded her of something she couldn't identify. But that resonated in her memory in an unsettling way. She felt as if she was about to unravel a long-dormant enigma, a secret that the universe, in its infinite and whimsical wisdom, had finally decided to put in her path. The spark turned into a small flame, fueled by the possibility, by the remote hope that her life could be more than the echo of a service bell. From that day on, Valeria's life acquired a dual layer. During her days in the Santoro mansion, she continued to be the discreet wife, the silent shadow. But in the privacy of her room, when the mansion fell into the silence of the night, Valeria transformed into a tireless investigator. The letter became her obsession, the focus of every free minute. After attending social events and formal dinners, she would sit at her desk under the scarce light of a lamp, her hazel eyes, previously dulled by fatigue, now shone with a feverish intensity. The first phase was deciphering the annotations. There were references to a truncated legacy, to lost papers, and to a last wish that had not been fulfilled. Her mind, accustomed to unraveling logical problems and memorizing complex sequences of facts, began to process the information instinctively. She delved into the library's archives, searching for any document that mentioned Marco or her grandmother, Ilara. She used the mansion's internet access, searching legal databases, historical archives, old newspaper articles. She spent hours typing combinations, feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins, the fear of being discovered, cold sweat on her forehead as her fingers trembled on the keys. She remembered the initial frustration, the abyss of not understanding. A whole day passed trying to decipher a single keyword in an ancient will. Feeling discouragement threatened to overwhelm her. Tears of impotence welled in her eyes as the dawn light filtered through her window, reminding her of the hours stolen from sleep, from rest. But then, a flash. A name repeated itself, that of a retired notary who had worked for the Santoro family. The connection, though minuscule, was enough to rekindle her determination. She discovered that the letter was not just a personal message, but the first clue to a complex plot. Valeria's grandmother, Ilara, had been the fiancée of Gabriel Santoro's great-uncle, a man named Julian, who was the true heir to a significant portion of the Santoro family fortune, one that had been hidden and manipulated. But Julian had died young, unexpectedly, and his will, which designated Ilara and her future lineage as beneficiaries of part of that fortune through a trust, had been lost, or more likely, suppressed by Doña Isidora. The fortune Valeria had paid for with her marriage was, in part, hers by right of blood. A shiver ran down her spine. The man she had married, Gabriel, was the heir to an injustice that stretched across generations, and she herself was a victim of the same manipulation that had condemned her grandmother. The implications were overwhelming. What connection did that trust have to her own family, to the ruin of the publishing house? The question hammered in her mind day and night. Valeria's investigation was not limited to books and screens. She began to observe Doña Isidora with a new gaze, not that of the submissive wife, but that of the secret detective. Every gesture, every conversation she had in the mansion, every document she left in plain sight, became a piece of the puzzle. She risked, at times, getting too close, lingering a moment longer than allowed while picking up a napkin in the living room, just to catch a key phrase, a tone of voice that revealed nervousness, or a furtive glance that Doña Isidora directed at her personal lawyer, the elusive and calculating Señor Castro. Castro was the spitting image of legal corruption. An impeccable tailored suit, slicked back hair, and a gaze that could hide the darkest secrets. His contempt for Valeria was almost palpable, a constant sting in the air every time they crossed paths. Mrs. Valeria, we expect you to adjust to the family's schedule, too. The Santoros are a Swiss watch, not a dusty almanac. He had snapped at her once, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, as she lingered reading an old book. Valeria felt bile rise in her throat, rage contained in her chest, a sharp desire to return the humiliation. But she swallowed the words, clenching her teeth, channeling that rage into more hours of research, into more deciphered documents. On one occasion, while helping Doña Isidora organize some old files in the matriarch's private study, a privilege, in theory, which was actually an extra low-status task for her, she found a series of boxes labeled JS Legal Files. Sophia was not an expert in old documents, but her analytical mind and extensive reading had provided her with a basic understanding of how legal records were organized. She recalled a text fragment from the letter that seemed like a numerical key or a date. She spent hours unraveling the content, feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins, the fear of being discovered, cold sweat on her forehead as her fingers trembled over the dusty papers. Again and again, the information seemed incomplete. The names didn't quite fit. Despair washed over her, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Would this be the end? Would this be the limit of her ingenuity? A pang of pain reminded her of her father, of Sophia, of the need not to give up. She thought of the letter's calligraphy, of the small details of her grandmother's letters. What if the key wasn't a date, but a keyword? Not a name, a nickname. The nickname Julian used for her grandmother in some of the most intimate letters. My Silent Star. With renewed determination, she searched the archives with that nickname. The sound of an old latch opening a secret compartment inside an antique box was like a symphony, a choir of angels in the middle of the night. Inside that compartment, Valeria found irrefutable evidence. Julian Santoro's original will, which designated her grandmother, Ilara, as the beneficiary of a substantial trust, and left her in charge of a significant collection of art and family properties. There were also additional letters from Julian, explaining his concern about his sister Isadora's ambition, and his desire to ensure the happiness of Ilara and any descendants they might have. It was proof of the legacy the letter mentioned, but not a legacy of fortune, but of deception and suppression. There were names, dates, figures, everything needed to dismantle decades of injustice. And most shockingly, a clause in Julian's will stipulating that if his original will was ignored or suppressed by his family, the fortune bequeathed to Ilara would automatically pass to her direct heir, with compound interest that had multiplied it exponentially. And that direct heir was her mother, Ilara, daughter of grandmother Ilara, and by extension, herself. A shock ran through every fiber of her being. An icy cold permeated her bones, followed by a wave of heat that made her cheeks burn. Her breathing became erratic, choppy. It was her. She was the key piece, the connection she hadn't seen. Her mind raced and raced, trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. She was not a simple contract wife. She was not just the bankrupt bookseller's daughter. She was the heiress to an immense fortune, a fortune that the Santoros had manipulated and hidden for generations. Rage, an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel with such intensity, began to bubble within her. Rage for the life they had stolen from her, for the truth they had hidden from her, for the hardships she had lived while others enjoyed a wealth that, perhaps, rightfully belonged to her. Her throat closed, preventing her from breathing normally. Her eyes welled up, but they were not tears of sadness, but of an icy fury, of an iron determination. No, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. This will not stand. No, never. Incredulity had transformed into an undeniable truth, both heavy and liberating. The discovery of the will and Doña Isadora's direct involvement not only broadened Valeria's investigation, but also prompted her to seek support. She knew she couldn't face such a powerful Santoro empire alone. She needed allies, trustworthy people who believed in her and her story. The first person she dared to approach was Gabriel, her own contract husband. The decision wasn't easy. How could she trust a man who was part of the system that oppressed her? But there was something in his eyes, a melancholy she sometimes perceived in his silent moments, a distance from his own family, that made her doubt his complete complicity. She approached him one night, when Gabriel returned exhausted from a business meeting, the air thick with the weight of his mother's expectations. He had sat in an armchair, his gaze lost in the fireplace's flames. Valeria, with her heart in her throat, approached and placed Julian's original will in his hands. "Gabriel," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know this will sound crazy, but I've discovered something about your great-uncle and about my grandmother that changes everything we know about our families and about this union. Gabriel read it, first with disbelief, then with growing astonishment. His eyes, which had been distant, locked onto Valeria's, filled with a mixture of shock and a vulnerability she had never seen. Is this real?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "My mother always said Julian was a spendthrift, that he had left nothing." Valeria, calmly, showed him the letters, the property records, the discrepancies in the Santoro fortune's financial statements, data her brilliant mind had unearthed. Gabriel, who had grown up under Doña Isadora's shadow, always felt that something didn't fit in his family's official story. He himself had been subject to manipulation, bound by a duty he didn't fully understand. Seeing the evidence in black and white, his own mother's betrayal, opened his eyes to the truth of his contract marriage. He saw the injustice, the greed, and Valeria's brave determination. He, who had believed himself master of his destiny, discovered he was as much a prisoner as she was. Their trust was forged in the fire of shared betrayal. "Valeria," he whispered that night as he held her in his arms, a warmth they had never shared. "You are the only one for me. The only one who has had the courage to see the truth in this golden cage. Count on me. Together, we will make them pay for this. Not just for you, but for my Uncle Julian, and for the truth." His words, spoken with a sincerity that took her breath away, were the turning point. Gabriel, with his access to the Santoro family's internal files, his contacts in the legal and financial world, and his knowledge of his mother's weaknesses, became the most crucial ally, her accomplice in the dark, her protector. The second ally arrived through Gabriel, Miss Elisa, an old and loyal secretary of Julian Santoro, who had been unjustly dismissed by Doña Isadora after Julian's death. Elisa, now an elderly woman with silver hair and a shrewd gaze, lived modestly, secretly harboring the pain of injustice and the knowledge of the truth. Gabriel and Valeria visited her in her small apartment, where the scent of herbal tea and memories mingled in the air. At first, Elisa was reluctant. Fear of Doña Isadora still paralyzed her. "The Santoros are powerful young people. They devour anyone who opposes them," she warned them, her hands trembling slightly as she offered them coffee. But Valeria, with a calmness she had learned from pain and determination, showed her the original will, Julian's letters, the photo of her grandmother, Ilara. She told her about the injustice her grandmother had suffered, and how that pain had extended to her own family, and now to hers with Gabriel. Gabriel, for his part, pleaded with her, showing her his own indignation and desire for justice. For hours they talked. Elisa saw the intelligence, tenacity, and resilience in Valeria's eyes, and the honesty in Gabriel's face, something she rarely saw in a Santoro. She saw how, despite her setbacks, Valeria did not give up. She saw the hidden treasure of her intellect, the mind capable of connecting dots that no one else saw. Elisa, who had worked with Julian for years and had witnessed his love for Ilara and his distrust of Isadora, felt that this was the moment she had been waiting for. "I always knew the truth would come to light, and I will do it. For Mr. Julian and for Miss Ilara," said Elisa, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She provided vital documents she had kept secret, records of the financial transactions Isadora had manipulated, copies of internal communications, and her unwavering testimony. She became an emotional pillar and an invaluable source of information. Her knowledge of the Santoro family's inner workings was a powerful weapon. The tension became palpable. Doña Isadora, a woman accustomed to absolute control and well-guarded secrets, began to feel that something was stirring in the shadows. Valeria, who was once an almost invisible figure in the mansion, now had a strange confidence in her stride, a different light in her eyes. She had stopped responding with submission to Doña Isadora's derogatory comments, answering instead with serene glances that disquieted the matriarch. Strange rumors began to reach her ears. Gabriel, her son, spending more time with Valeria, whispers of a lost will, and even the appearance of the old secretary Elisa. Doña Isadora's paranoia grew like a weed, and her eyes, once so self-assured, now sought culprits in every corner. Valeria, have you become daring? You look like a private investigator with your questions. Remember your place. You have no business prying into my past or this family's, she snapped one morning, her voice hoarse with barely contained fury. When Valeria, unknowingly, lingered a moment longer, observing an antique painting of Julian Santoro in the grand living room. Valeria's skin tingled. A shiver of fear ran down her spine. I was only admiring the art, Doña Isadora. A taste that, it seems, you shared with your brother Julian, she replied, her voice calm but with a firmness she had not used before. Her heart hammered in her chest, a runaway drum. But, deep within her, a small voice told her, "Don't be a coward now. You're close." Doña Isadora's gaze, laden with suspicion and contempt, was a preview of the hurricane to come. Mr. Castro, the family lawyer, also intensified his harassment. One day, while Valeria was reviewing some books in the library, Castro approached, his expensive, cloying perfume filling the small room. "Listen, Valeria," he said, his voice low and icy, but with an edge of threat that cut through her. "I've noticed that lately you're too interested in matters that don't concern you. I remind you that your position here is precarious. If you keep prying where you're not called, I promise you will regret every breath you've taken in this mansion. No one messes with Doña Isadora and gets away unscathed." Castro, with a wolfish smile, patted her shoulder, a subtle, almost imperceptible shove that made Valeria stumble. The physical pain was less than the burning humiliation, the rage bubbling inside her. "Understood, mister." "Castro," Valeria replied, her voice trembling slightly, but her hazel eyes met Castro's with unexpected firmness. There was a spark of defiance, a fire Castro didn't expect to see in the bought wife's eyes. Castro felt a chill. That wasn't the Valeria he knew. Something had changed. "Remember what I told you," Castro growled, his expression hardening, and he left. Valeria stood there, heart pounding and body tense, not just from the shove, but from the injustice. Her fists clenched. "They won't stop me," she told herself. "Not now that I'm so close." Every interaction with them, every contemptuous look, every veiled threat didn't cow her, but rather fanned the flame of her determination. She felt fear, yes, a visceral fear that dried her mouth and made her palms sweat. But that fear was eclipsed by a righteous anger, by the image of her father and sister suffering, by the legacy of poverty her grandmother had endured, by the truth that had been denied to her. "Let them try to stop me," she thought, with an unbreakable resolve. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." The moment of truth was approaching, and Valeria felt it in every beat of her heart, in every fiber of her being. And then came the night of the great annual gala of the Santoro Foundation, a charity and business event where Doña Isadora would publicly announce the expansion of the family empire and, supposedly, honor the memory of the late Julian with a symbolic donation. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the Santoro mansion, the same place where Valeria had felt so invisible. The air vibrated with the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the sparkle of thousands of diamonds. The crème de la crème of society had gathered, dressed in their finery, to pay homage to Doña Isidora and her unblemished legacy. Valeria, dressed in a simple but elegant dress she had modified herself for the occasion, moved through the crowd with Gabriel by her side, her heart pounding with a mixture of panic and euphoria. Elisa was among the audience, mingled with the guests, with a small, discreet recording team. The atmosphere was one of celebration, of blatant opulence. Doña Isidora, standing on the main stage with Señor Castro by her side, radiated confidence, her smile as pristine as her designer's suit. She began her speech, her voice deep and resonant, speaking of her unwavering commitment to philanthropy, her passion for transparency, and the need to honor the memory of my dear brother Julian, whose legacy we have known how to protect and enhance. The words flowed from her mouth like honey, cloying and false, each one a dagger to Valeria's heart. She, at the back of the hall, watched, every fiber of her being tense. Ready. Gabrielle, by her side, squeezed her hand, a gesture of silent support that filled her with strength. Suddenly, just as Doña Isidora was about to unveil a commemorative plaque for Julián, with a smug smile that indicated she considered it a mere formality, the lights of the grand hall, which had previously shone with dazzling intensity, flickered and then completely extinguished, plunging the vast space into an unsettling gloom. The murmurs ceased, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by a few muffled exclamations. A spotlight, meticulously prepared by Gabrielle with Elisa's help, illuminated, pointing directly at the stage. But not at Doña Isidora. It landed on a hidden projector, which Gabriel and Valeria had discreetly installed hours earlier. The image that appeared on the giant screen behind the stage was not the Santoro Foundation logo, but an enlarged photo of Marco's letter to her grandmother, next to the word truth in large red capital letters. The reaction was instantaneous. Doña Isidora froze, her face, illuminated by the projector's dim light, turned pale, almost ashen. Señor Castro, by her side, gasped, his eyes, previously so arrogant, now wide with horror. The guests began to murmur, the silence broken by a growing chorus of questions, of astonishment. Valeria, with an authority she had never possessed, activated the main microphone that Gabriel had discreetly connected. Her voice, clear and firm, resonated through the hall, amplified with a cadence no one expected from the silent wife. "Good evening, distinguished guests," Valeria began, each word a precise note in the symphony of her vindication. Her voice did not tremble. There was no trace of the humiliated bride, but that of a woman who had found her power. Doña Isidora has spoken of legacy and transparency. Allow me to show you what that truly means. On the giant screen, the pages of the letter and Julian Santoro's original will began to scroll one after another, not just as static images, but with crucial clauses highlighted, accompanied by financial documents that Gabriel had expertly prepared. Manipulated bank transfers, inflated Santoro fortune balances, and a scheme of how Julian's trust had been diverted for decades. The hall filled with a murmur of disbelief, then indignation. The faces of the guests, previously smiling and carefree, contorted into grimaces of astonishment and distrust. Doña Isidora, recovering from the initial shock, tried to react. "This is an attack, a vulgar forgery, security. Get this insolent woman out," she shrieked, her voice choked with rage, her face flushed, the veins in her neck swollen. She pointed at Valeria, who had now advanced to the center of the hall, her figure small but imposing under the spotlight, with Gabriel firmly by her side. Her eyes, previously full of contempt, now reflected a growing desperation, a cornered beast. Her hands trembled visibly, not from anger, but from pure panic. Senor Castro, for his part, tried to approach the projector to turn it off. But Elisa, with surprising agility for her age, stepped in, blocking his path with an iron gaze. "Not so fast, Mr. Castro. It's time for the truth to come out," the old woman hissed, her eyes spitting fire. People began to shout, demanding explanations. Chaos was starting to engulf the festive atmosphere. Valeria, unfazed, continued. "The evidence you see here is not false, Doña Isidora. It is the testament of a forbidden love, of a hidden trust, and of a fortune that belongs, by right, to the legitimate heiress of Julian Santoro and Ilara, my grandmother. My family was reduced to bankruptcy by a debt that, ironically, was part of the fortune that rightfully belonged to me." Tears welled in the eyes of several guests, moved by the starkness of her words. Doña Isidora was sweating profusely, her dress clinging to her back, her pulse raced uncontrollably, her breathing became shallow and rapid. She tried to stammer something, anything. But the words stuck in her throat, turning into an inarticulate moan. Senor Castro, by her side, had fallen silent, his mouth dry and his eyes fixed on the screen, where the fortune's movements over the years were now displayed, with Doña Isidora's signature on every manipulation. "But there's more," Valeria said, her voice rising above the clamor, her gaze fixed on Doña Isidora, a gaze that left no room for evasion. "This trust, which my grandmother could never claim, and from which your family illegally benefited, was intended for his child. And I, Doña Isidora, am that heir. Not the contract wife you so despise, but the sole heir to the immense legacy of the Santoro Montes family." On the screen, legal documents now appeared proving the secret marriage of her grandmother, Ilara, and Julian Santoro, sealed in a small Santoro family chapel in the countryside. A marriage that invalidated any attempt to disinherit her and legitimized every cent of the trust. The power shift was instantaneous, brutal, and definitive. The hall erupted. Cries of fraud, lies, justice echoed throughout the space. The power dynamic reversed in an instant, brutally and definitively. Doña Isidora, the Grand Matriarch, cowered on the stage, her face a mask of horror, her once imposing figure now reduced to that of a humiliated, exposed woman. Senor Castro, completely beside himself, tried to lash out at Valeria, his eyes bloodshot. But Gabriel and Elisa restrained him, one on each side, like two unwavering guardians, while the guests recoiled in horror. Some guests stood up, indignant, calling the police. The media cameras, which had previously been focused on the stage to cover the glamorous gala, now turned towards Valeria and Gabriel, capturing every detail of their triumph. Valeria, with newfound dignity, concluded her revelation. Truth, like blood, always finds a way to surface. Today, my grandmother's love and my family's legacy rise from the ashes, and justice at last begins its journey. Valeria's words resonated with relentless force, sealing the fate of Doña Isidora and Senor Castro in that crowded hall. The police, alerted by Gabriel with a discreet message before the blackout, arrived in minutes, bursting into the chaos. Doña Isidora and Senor Castro were arrested on the very stage where they had celebrated their opulence, their faces reflecting a mixture of impotent fury and abject terror. Their hands, the same ones that had signed fraudulent documents and rejected Valeria's dignity, were now handcuffed, pleading. Their fall was as swift and devastating as their rise. News of the Santoro scandal spread like wildfire, not only through the city, but nationally and internationally. Newspapers, led by a journalistic investigation that Gabriel had previously leaked to his trusted contact, published front-page headlines. The Santoro millionaire secret, the truth behind the fortune. The contract wife who dethroned the matriarch. The hidden love that uncovered decades of fraud. The trials were long and highly publicized. Valeria and Gabriel's evidence, the original will, the letters, the trust documents, and her grandmother's secret marriage. The testimonies of Elisa and other former family employees who dared to speak was irrefutable. Doña Isadora and Señor Castro were found guilty of massive fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Their sentence was severe. Years in prison and the confiscation of a large portion of their properties to compensate Valeria and restore the fortune that rightfully belonged to her, including Julian's vast art collection and properties. Their descent was brutal and public. News detailed how they were stripped of their mansions, their businesses dismantled, their accounts frozen. Images showed them, gaunt in prison uniforms, their eyes, once full of arrogance, now empty and sunken. The same circles of power that once flattered them now vehemently repudiated them, fearful of tarnishing their own reputations. Doña Isadora, who had lived surrounded by luxury, now faced the harsh reality of prison, her once carefully maintained face now distorted by panic and despair. Señor Castro, who had dreamed of a future of power, was forced to do manual labor in prison, his arrogance crushed by monotony and harsh reality. The image of both, once untouchable, now stripped of everything, was broadcast repeatedly on news channels. Their support networks crumbled. Their high society friends abandoned them instantly. What were once complacent smiles turned into frowns, and whispers of admiration became murmurs of contempt. The fall of Doña Isadora and Señor Castro was a public spectacle of degradation, a visceral lesson that justice, though slow, sometimes arrives with relentless force. As the matriarch and her lawyers sank, Valeria's life, like the phoenix of her legacy, rose from the ashes. Not only was she proven to be the sole legitimate heir to the Santoro Montes fortune, but her story of courage, intelligence, and resilience transformed her into an inspiring figure. Valeria's first priority was her family. Her father's publishing house was rescued and relaunched, with a new vision and financial solidity that propelled it to the top. Her father, freed from the burden of debt, regained his health and joy, returning to his passion for books with renewed energy. Her little sister, Sophia, was able to study ballet at the prestigious school of her dreams, shining with a light that once seemed unattainable. Seeing the genuine happiness in her father's eyes and the vibrant enthusiasm in Sophia's was Valeria's true reward, a balm for all the wounds of the past. Valeria did not limit herself to enjoying her new wealth. True to her origins and the values that had always guided her, and honoring the memory of her grandmother and Julian, she founded the Santoro Montes Foundation for Transparency and Justice, a program that offered free legal advice to families who were victims of fraud and disputed inheritances, seeking to preserve forgotten stories and promote justice in the legal field. She became the president of the foundation, leading with a vision and compassion that contrasted sharply with the greed of her in-laws. Her former modesty transformed into a natural elegance. Her hair now fell in soft waves, and her hands, though still reflecting the history of work, looked well cared for, with a shine they previously lacked, sometimes adorned with a discreet bracelet from Julian, a symbol of her recovered heritage. Her office, on the top floor of the Santoro skyscraper, overlooking the city, was a space of light and clarity. very different from the dark corners where she used to hide to investigate. Gabriel, now her husband by choice and not by contract, became her most loyal partner, leading the relaunch of the Santoro Empire with a new ethic of integrity and philanthropy. And his love for Valeria grew beyond all expectations, a union forged in truth and mutual respect. The reunions were inevitable and often cathartic. One afternoon, as she exited an elevator at a foundation event, she came face to face with Aunt Elvira, the same woman who had once belittled her over her father's ruin. Aunt Elvira recognized her instantly, though Valeria now wore an impeccable silk dress and a confident smile. Her eyes widened, and a blush of shame rose to her face. "Oh, dear Valeria, what an honor! Allow me," she stammered, extending a hand that Valeria barely touched with a distant courtesy. Valeria offered a serene smile. "Don't worry, Aunt Elvira. I no longer search for solutions. Now I create them. And truth, sometimes, takes time to arrive, but it does." The shame on the woman's face was a silent, deep vindication. And then there was Elisa. She became the director of the Foundation's History and Archives programs, a position tailored to her. When Valeria visited her in her new office, filled with antique books and digitized documents, her eyes welled up with tears. "My child, you did it." "Julian and Alara's story finally told as it should be," she said, her voice choked. Valeria embraced her with genuine affection, a warm smile reaching her hazel eyes. "And you, Elisa, were the first guardian of that story. I will never forget it." The expression of admiration and pride on the elderly woman's face mirrored the appreciation Valeria felt for those who had always seen her worth, even when she herself did not perceive it. Valeria's story became a beacon of hope, a living reminder that human dignity is not measured by wealth or inherited status, but by integrity and strength of spirit. She demonstrated that a person's worth does not lie in the superficial glitter of appearances or in noble titles, but in the depth of their character, in their ability to resist adversity and to fight for justice. Her legacy would endure far beyond her life, inspiring generations not to give up, to seek truth, and to believe in the transformative power of perseverance and compassion, and in the magic of untold stories and true loves that defy time. Today, the Santoro Montes Foundation is a global benchmark, a testament to the impact that a single person, one who was underestimated and silenced, can have on the world. Valeria, now a mature woman with the serenity of one who has overcome the toughest trials, continues to be the driving force behind its mission, demonstrating that true power lies in the ability to uplift others, to build bridges where there were once only abysses of inequality. And so, my dear friend, this unfiltered story closes, leaving us with the inspiring truth that the most difficult path is often the one that leads to the greatest rewards, and that a sincere whisper of love can break the spell of obligation and reveal a destiny grander than we ever imagined.